Throughout the retouching process, my ethos is always making sure that everything is harmonized, whether it's skin texture, color, or light. In this section, we're going to use a clone brush, masking, and layers to achieve the best skin texture possible in the shortest amount of time. Skin texture is something that can become really difficult with subjects that have really rough skin texture. It's not something that happens all the time, but I think when we're dealing with a complete retouch, there's a harmony that happens when it comes to getting really nice transitions. There's a harmony that happens when you get really nice color, but there's a harmony that happens with skin texture across the frame. And what I mean is that every area should be a little similar when it comes to how rough or soft that looks, because once everything else is perfected and the skin texture is off, it becomes more noticeable. Let's say we use this image as an example, also shot by Sue. And what I would recommend is that once you're done with the healing process and the cloning process, you want to be sure that everything across the skin tone range is really harmonized. And there's an easy way to do that. And typically, you want to do this before the dodge and burn stage. If you're not familiar with the whole retouching process, I definitely recommend looking at one of the full retouches to see where this can come into play. Usually, it's in the healing and cloning section because we're using the cloning brush to also smooth out some of the rough skin texture across the face. This also works for fine hairs, which I use this as an example for, or also delicately minimizing hot spots as well as under eyes and things like that. Even wrinkles. So it's a multi-purpose tool, but you have to use it correctly. First thing we'll do here is we'll create a blank layer. We'll name this skin texture. And if you're doing a full retouch, and you want to use a clone brush as its single layer, you can rename that clone brush and do a multitude of things in it. So you don't have to section everything off independently, so keep that in mind. Now that we have the single layer here, I'm going to select my clone brush. I'm going to keep my flow set to around 3%. I'll zoom in here a little bit, and I'm going to sample anywhere that I want to use as a good piece of skin texture. Then, if we're focusing on the under eyes, I'm going to start brushing, resampling, and brushing. The key here is not to click multiple times, but to simply brush back and forth till the rough skin texture starts dissipating. The other reason for that is once the skin texture is dissipated to match the surrounding areas, it becomes easier and easier to do the rest of the process. So whether it is using frequency separation or dodging and burning or anything like that going forward, the retouching becomes a lot easier to do. Trying to even out skin texture with dodge and burn can be an arduous process, but this makes quick order of making sure that the texture is a lot softer without overdoing it. This also works because you're not trying to replace or soften the texture with a paintbrush, but you're utilizing some of the good texture all over the face. And that overlaying effect is causing a softening rather than a complete blur of whatever you're doing. And if I turn this layer on and off really quick, you'll see that the under eye softened up, a little bit of the side of the face softened up, the chin softened up, some of the hot spots softened up, but it's not softened to a point that it looks unnatural. You see how it now harmonizes the rest of the skin as well? And that's what we're kind of going for. We're not totally changing everything. in this part of the process is, just the beginning. And then after this, you dodge and burn and continue with the rest of the process. But harmonizing the texture is the name of the game here. And I'm just sampling and brushing. The direction to brush always depends on what you're trying to do. If I'm trying to soften up this area here, then I would simply sample on that shadow line and then move a few pixels and brush up on that shadow line. And that overlaying effect is going to kind of soften that texture, and that's exactly what's happening. It's overlay of one texture on top of another one to replace it, not completely, but at around 50% or less, or maybe even 20%, just based on how many brush strokes that you do. The same thing happens for the forehead. So if I erase that section, and if I zoom in here, all I need to do is sample somewhere in the vicinity. Then I'll move a few steps over and then start brushing. And you'll notice that the texture just gently feathers away. And I'm only doing 4 or 5 strokes at max at 3% flow. If you're doing too many strokes, it's going to look weird. So keep that in mind. Don't do too many strokes and keep a consistent workflow going. Always zoom out again every now and then to keep a good eye on what's happening. And this, by default, sets up a really good base in retouching the rest of your images. The same thing happens over here if you're trying to diminish the effect of those hard shadows. You can break them up. And the sides of the face too. This also works on the lips. So if you're trying to gently feather out those lips, that works. And even here, if you want to remove that hard shadow, I'll just sample above, and it just kind of tapers that away. And now when I'm zoomed out and I turn the layer on and off, just like that, I've minimized the skin texture. Again, because we're on a blank layer, here's the beauty of it. If you've gone too far somewhere, all you need to do is add a mask. And then we can simply use a black brush with a low flow and bring it back. Because I think that shadow actually was quite useful, so we're not going to modify that. And see, just like that, the skin texture still is pretty normal, but it's a lot less reduced, it's softer, it's a lot more pleasing. From here, you end up going to your dodge and burn or your frequency separation to continue your workflow, and then progress by doing whatever it is that you want to do. So if I'm trying to, dodge this and lighten some of these areas, I can do that, and then use frequency separation to bring it home. This is why softening that skin texture in the beginning is so worth it, because it sets up easier workflow when you're trying to retouch while still keeping as much texture as possible. So we're not trying to remove all the texture per se, but we're just minimizing it enough where the rest of the process becomes easier and there's a unification effect happening across the entire range of the skin texture. And on this layer, I have my burn tool that I'll be dodging and burning. So there you have it. Let's recap really quickly. I'll turn these 2 layers on and off to show you exactly how much easier dodging and burning was. And this is where most of the effect happened. And you can see it's really great, especially if you have a client that you might want to do a quick minimal retouch. This might be a great way to do it. So we use a clone brush with a 2% flow or a 5% flow, something really gentle. And we sampled right on the skin, we moved a few pixels over, and we started brushing. The good part is you don't really need a good area to source from. So even if all the skin texture is rough, you can still sample in that general area, as long as you move your clone brush away and then start brushing again, you're able to make that a lot more pleasing. And then when you follow it up with a mask to make sure that you haven't gone too far, it's such a great combination. If you try to do that on your background layer, what happens is you're stuck, and that can become a problem. And it's tricky trying to bring that back. And that's why I like using layers and keeping everything sectioned off. Then from there, if you want to use your dodge and burn to further minimize that texture, it's a really wonderful process of keeping that realism in your portraits while also minimizing the hard effects of skin texture.